Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation. Thank you for joining in. I am Matt Kleinhens, a vegetable extension specialist at The Ohio State University. I work from an office at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center in Worcester, which is where I am now. My job in the next 90 minutes is to ensure that you are rewarded in at least two ways for the time that you spend in the conversation. The way that you should be rewarded is with information you can use, and the second way is in recognizing that your input is important and that we hope that you can join us going forward. We're starting promptly at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, recognition of people's busy schedules. The entry tones for those who are joining the call have been muted, so folks may be joining us kind of midstream as we get started here. Our immediate goal is to understand and to gain more completely from the philosophy and practice of soil balancing. Soil balancing is complex, and it seems that it is a go-to set of practices for a sizable number of farmers, perhaps especially organic. On the other hand, overall, the university research extension community remains skeptical of soil balancing, saying that claims about it are exaggerated, and while they recommend other approaches. Now, that distinction alone is reason enough for us to chat and to turn to numbers for help. However, as we address various questions about soil balancing, we will also learn about soils, crops, farms, farmers, and people who advise and supply farmers. We will also discover what and how these folks observe and come to claim as their specific knowledge. This conversation should extend beyond the time we share today. Please join in the one that's scheduled for December 12th, and if you'd like, you can listen to the recording of the conversation that took place on October 17th. Soon I will introduce today's resource people, but before doing that and opening the conversation, we need to go through 3 important bits of background. First, there are 2 simple ground rules for the call. Number 1, we're going to mute all call participants at this point. Okay, so everyone is muted at this point. I'm the only one that can be heard for the moment, but that's going to change soon. To be heard, please unmute yourself by pressing *6 if you happen to be using a mobile phone, and of course you may have a desk phone that has its own mute control. Then please mute yourself by pressing *6 again, or the mute button, when you are finished. This will prevent background noise from disrupting the conversation or you from having an embarrassing moment. And there have been a few of those through the years on other calls I've hosted. So just a word to the wise on that. Next, please listen carefully, but also speak up when you're invited to or when you feel the need to. Our panelists, will add to the discussion, but it's your input, your comments, your questions that are also essential. And if you feel like speaking up, of course, we would like to hear from you directly. If, however, you would like to submit a comment or question by email, or by not by email, I apologize, but by an online portal that remains anonymous, you may do that as well. The URL for that submission portal is go.osu.edu/SBNow. I believe the SB is no longer case sensitive. Right. So that URL again is go.osu.edu/SBNow. That's a URL where you can submit a comment or question and do so completely anonymously. And that link is going to remain active throughout this discussion and afterwards, so please do use it to share feedback about the call. So I'm going to pause at this point and ask if there are any questions about the ground rules, and we'll unmute you to do that. You have to press *5 again to unmute folks. Speak up if you have any questions about the ground rules by pressing *6 or unmuting yourself. Okay, hearing no questions about the ground rules, here's a second bit of background. The second bit of background is that this call is made possible because of support from a grant from the USDA Organic Research and Extension Initiative. We want to acknowledge this support because it is very important. We would also like to thank individuals and organizations that helped spread the word about this conversation. Our partners at OFA, at SARE, with Acres, Farm and Dairy, and numerous other grower organizations and individuals have been very kind to share announcements about this discussion and this OSU-led effort to help improve people's understanding of soil balancing. And for the third and final bit of background, before we get started, you may be wondering who else is on the call. I'm not in a position to reveal individual identities, of course, but I can share the following information about the overall registering group. It represents 14 states, 3 countries, and various farms, universities, businesses, and organizations. It includes people working with grains, forages, horticultural, and other crops. And finally, most of the registrants indicated that they have modest, if any, experience with soil balancing, but quite a range is represented within the registrant group, from a large amount of experience with soil balancing to very little or none. So it is appropriate to focus our conversations today on the numbers specific to soil balancing. As you speak up or post a comment or question, however, feel free to introduce yourself, say where you're from, and maybe elaborate on how you came to be interested in soil balancing. So unless there are questions, that completes our background. So are there any questions before we start? Remember to unmute yourself if needed. Okay.
Hi, Matt. This is Vijay.
Yes. Did you have a comment or question?
Oh, I just joined the conversation, so I just wanted to let you know that I'm here.
Okay. Good to have you here. Thank you.
Yep.
So along with him, we have you, the call-in participants. There are 6 people committed to serving as resource people. In alphabetical order, they are Drs. Steve Coleman, Doug Dewan, I believe, may be on the line. He may have come in after the ping notices were muted. But we certainly have Steve Coleman here in the room, Doug Jackson-Smith here in the room, both of them of Ohio State University. And Doug, I think you were clarifying that you're here.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So we also have Bob Jones Jr. of the Chef's Garden, Josh McGrath of the University of Kentucky, and Joe Nestor of Nestor Ag LLC. So these 6 people have committed themselves to being perhaps primary focal point people for addressing specific questions and comments, but they are certainly not the only people that we hope to hear from today. We do hope to hear from those of you who have called in. So those 6 resource people plus yourself will address the main topic of today, which is soil balancing by the numbers. And I'll offer just a very, very quick prelude, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. Today, I would ask you to consider that soil balancing is a philosophy whose practitioners and detractors can be counted, although with some complications. I'd also like you to consider that soil balancing requires inputs to implement. These inputs can be categorized and quantified, although, again, probably imperfectly. I'd also like you to consider that soil balancing includes practices that can be tested alone or in combination with each other, again with measurable effects, although making sense of those experimental results for farm use can be difficult. So today, numbers are the focus, and a whole range of numbers in your that you have at your command, numbers that you would wish to have at your command but don't have yet. We're going to try to focus our conversation around the numbers specific to soil balancing. So, Joe, you're with us today, and we're really glad that that's the case. I'd like for you to comment first. Your experience with farms and soils is immense. If you'd be willing to, please share a little bit about that experience in terms of the number of years you've been involved working with farmers, perhaps a broad brush stroke about how many farmers that might include and the number of farms and acreage, and any other aspect that you would choose to highlight about your operation, and we can get started.
Okay. Can you hear me, Matt?
Hear you well. Thank you.
Okay. I'm located right in northwest Ohio. I have been here all my life and worked the last 42 years in agronomy in this area. 16 years as a retail fertilizer plant manager, and then the last 26 years as an independent crop consultant. Out of my office here, we've got 5 consultants working, and we manage about 200,000 acres in the Ohio, Michigan, Indiana area, but most of that land is in the western Lake Erie Basin, so probably 70% of it is what you would call heavy clay soils. We also network with a group of consultants that uses Brookside Laboratories, the same lab that we use, and those consultants account for about 4 million acres in the eastern Corn Belt. So I started working with soil balance philosophies in 1993 after learning that from some very successful consultants. And prior to that, the 16 years prior to that, I was not doing anything with soil balancing.
Excellent. So you have a really unique vantage point as somebody who started somewhat outside of soil balancing, but have now been working with it for an appreciable number of years. Have you seen a shift in the number of acres or farms that are interested in soil balancing?
Yeah, definitely. You know, we really struggled with these high clay content soils for some time. You know, we've got some of these soil types are 70% clay, and you know, too wet, and when they dry out, they're too hard, and we struggled with no-till for quite some time. But when we started paying close attention to that calcium-magnesium relationship, we started getting a lot better success, enhanced water infiltration on those soils. And once we started using a lot of high calcium lime, the main source around here is water treatment from cities. And when we started using that, there are other people that jumped on board with it too.
So, Joe, not to keep the spotlight too much on you particularly at this time, but we'll definitely boomerang back around. Of the 200,000 acres that you are most familiar with, are they all employing a soil balancing-like philosophy or some component of the practice?
Yes, they are, Matt, and I want to clarify that. You know, we're speaking particularly the higher exchange soils where internal drainage is an issue. We do have some sand ridges and some sand soil types, some glacial till soils that we deal with, and on those acres, then we do not use that balance philosophy. We have to approach that on a SLAN method or sufficient level of available nutrients. Okay,
as perhaps the first foundational piece of the plan, you're saying?
Repeat that again, Matt.
As far on those other acres, you may be looking at SLAN as the first foundational piece.
Definitely.
Of the management plan.
Definitely, we have some challenges with magnesium for crop uptake levels on those light sands. So. Okay. We have to look at those differently.
And I know that one final question for you at the moment before we turn to Bob. The 4 million acres that you mentioned that Brookside works with or somehow represent, maybe a representative of Brookside should be the best to comment. But if you were to guess, what % of that 4 million acres of Brookside is also very cognizant of soil balancing or maybe even preferentially using one or more of its practices?
Yeah, I would say nearly all of it, Matt, because those consultants network, get together 2 or 3 times a year and share all successes and failures, but they lead with the soil balance.
Sure. And just to clarify before we move to Bob, are these acres more or less exclusively grain, or is there some forage involved as well?
Oh, no, there's forage in there also. I would say primarily corn and soybeans. Wheat's a smaller part than what it used to be, but there are definitely some forages and livestock operations in that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Bob, if I could turn to you next. I mean, also Northwest Ohio location. also a wealth of experience with. For those that don't know the operation, Bob will elaborate on it if you choose to. The range of crops grown there is very, very impressive. Bob, can you share a little bit about the history of your use of various soil management philosophies, perhaps especially soil balancing? Like, when did it start to come onto the farm? How much of the farm is it? Are you using? How much of the farm is kind of managed with a soil balancing based approach? Any comments along those lines? And you may need to *6 to unmute. Bob, are you with us? We'll wait for Bob to reconnect, we hope. But so we heard Joe outline roughly 4.2 million acres, if there may be some overlap there, being managed with some component of soil balancing. Joe, with your network and any others that are on the call, is that the limit of it, or how far out does that acreage number go? Anyone care to comment? Have more that say no additional pockets of acreage? And again, you may need to start *6 your handset if you're going to comment.
This is Joe again, Matt. That's just this group of consultants that gets together regularly, and we've kind of ballparked some acreage, and we do that fairly regularly, so we know what kind of impact we're having out there. But I know there are a lot of other consultants outside of that organization that also pay attention to those soil balancing properties.
Sure. Joe, just for sake of clarification at this point, it's a good time to check in. How are you defining, or what are you including in your description of soil balancing, just so everyone's kind of on the same page as you are without becoming an academic exercise unto itself? We do need some clarification of what you describe as soil balancing.
Yeah, so, we've had guidelines on raising crops for years since I started in this business, and a lot of it's been focused on the chemical side, the N, P, and K, and it kind of assumes that everybody's the same out there, and boy, that's just not what we find. And I actually find that the physical and biological aspects of the soil have more impact on ultimate yield than actual N, P, and K does. So we're in working with these heavier clay soils, our main goal is to minimize stress and duration of stress on the crop. So we're trying to preserve yield because we continually stress this crop, and most of the stress on those clay soils comes from water. And it happens every year. It's too much up front and then too little in the month of August. And so the primary, I'm going to say the main soil balancing aspect I work with is we take and look very closely at the calcium-magnesium relationship on those clays. And I'm going to talk about exchange capacities of 12 and higher. And so we really look at that, Matt, and try to adjust that so that we can get better water infiltration rate.
Understood. So that's very helpful. So included within your description of soil balancing is obviously the CEC, maybe even the sand silt clay, texture, and other factors. But certainly, it seems that chemistry is first and foremost. Am I right on that?
Definitely. Yep.
Okay.
First place we look on the soil test, so that we know what we can do. We look at the exchange capacity, and then that calcium-mag relationship, and when the yield monitor came out and everybody's farms became test plots, it really gave us a lot more information when we could look at yield by calcium-mag relationship.
So, Joe, speaking of test plots, this is our second conversation in this set of three. And prior to our first conversation, a registrant actually submitted the following question. They asked, is this a valid theory, or is it more like, quote, chicken soup for the soil? What does the research indicate, and how viable is it to think that we can alter soil, quote, balances quickly to have immediate impacts? Now, I'd like, if you're willing, I'd like for you to comment on that, and then I'll turn to Steve maybe to follow up. But that's a big question. Is this valid, or is it chicken soup for the soil? Not bad, not good, just helpful. And what does the research indicate? And research takes a lot of different forms. So I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth, but surely you have some experience. You obviously have the experience to indicate that it's more than valid. It's actually quite useful. So can you clarify with any sort of numbers that you have at your disposal, what a person could experience after kind of transitioning into a balancing-like approach on these heavy clay soils, for example, in terms of yield?
I think I can cover that pretty quickly here. We, for many years, and I was guilty of it the first 16 years here, we just tried to manage pH, and we sent grain trucks to the Port of Toledo, and we hauled back dolomite lime, and we had great pH, and the soils were nearly unmanageable. We couldn't even raise corn with it, get an adequate stand, and it crusted, and it was too wet in front of the tractor and too hard behind it, and so we started with the advice of some seasoned consultants. We looked at changing that relationship. We had a lot of 50% calcium-based saturations and 25 to 30% magnesium-based saturations, only because we dumped high mag lime on soils that were already high in mag, and so when we started adjusting that, when we start working with guys, we always have problem fields. This is a problem for me, or this area of the field is a problem for me. And undoubtedly, we find that the calcium and mag relationship is their major challenge. We also find in those poor yielding areas that very well could be the highest fertility in the field because of blanket applications and continual poor yield coming from those fields or zones within fields. So we adjust that, and it affects, when you look at it at a research point, we're normally small plots, and you plant them when you want to plant them, and you plant the whole plot at the same time. Well, what we're trying to do here is increase water infiltration, which magically, as that water moves through the soil, it draws air into the soil behind the water, and so now we're promoting the biological side, which in effect helps the physical side of that soil, and so we can get earlier planting, and with these weather challenges we have today, earlier planting is a godsend. We get less compaction. We can take heavy equipment out there and not damage the soil, as opposed to where those high magnesium zones, we can pick them out every time. And so we're trying to, by managing water moving through that soil, minimize stress and preserve yield. And again, it's not, I think, I've read in books and theories and things that this fits everywhere, and it doesn't fit everywhere. It doesn't fit everywhere in my market area. It doesn't fit everywhere within a field. If we've got heavy clay and high sands in the same field, we have to manage them totally different. But we've taken some really dog soils, and I'm talking some tougher Hoytvilles and Laddies and Paulding soils, and turned them into really well-producing soils. So it's, the farmer realizes it. I've never had anybody where we've managed soils in manipulating the calcium and mag in their favor say, I don't want to do this anymore. So it's probably been the number one thing that we've had as far as success in our consulting business.
Super input, Joe. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to turn to Steve next. So the question that was submitted by this previous registrant asked if this is valid theory or just chicken soup for the soil, and what does the research indicate? How likely is it to have positive impacts? I think the research group already appreciates that the past science, as I said in the intro, the past science continues to kind of poo-poo, or has poo-pooed soil balancing. Actually, not so much poo-pooed soil balancing as poo-pooed the claims about it, particularly focused on yield. Now, since we've been talking about mostly grain and forage acreage, Steve, you've been leading some experiments with grain and forage, both on the station and on the farms. What has your research shown with regard to the impacts of a soil balancing-like approach overall?
Sure. Well, we've got field sites really in a couple of areas. We have one in northwest Ohio, Wood County, that's on Hoytville soil, similar to the ones that Joe was just talking about. And then we also have a couple sites that are here in Worcester, and those are on more of a silt loam, lighter textured soils. And admittedly, we are just in our fourth or fifth year of those sites, depending. We've harvested those sites, but we don't have the numbers in for this fourth year in terms of the yield. But we have found, in terms of yield specifically, very little difference. Actually, just a few instances of differences, but nothing consistent in terms of grain yield.
Sure. Now, folks, in the interest of full disclosure, just so that there's some greater context added to some of these questions and some of the responses, Joe and Bob Jones Jr. have been very, very generous over the last 4 to 5 years in offering their insights, input, and recommendations to this OSU-led team as it works to help develop this more commonly shared understanding of soil balancing. Okay, so some aspects of the conversation that we're having right now, I don't want to say are old hat. They are definitely not old hat. What we're appreciating each time we hear some input is a different nuance of it. Okay, so Steve just mentioned that in many of the experiments he's conducted or he's led or been very close to, there's been what could be said as a minimal response in terms of yield. But I think that those results are not unique, Steve. I mean, BJ, you, and others have looked at this carefully. What has past research shown?
So there has been past research, and there's been, I wouldn't characterize it as a lot of it, but there has been probably a couple dozen studies that have been done over the last, say, most of that work stopped about 20 years ago or so, but in the 70s and 80s and 90s there was some work. Really all of those trials were really focused on yield, measured very few other parameters besides yield, and again, no difference with that. So the research itself, in terms of what's been published and vetted, as our currency in science, has shown that it's not a profitable way to manage soils.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, there's, as Joe mentioned, a lot has been written on the topic by so-called trained scientists with their credentials and their the letters that follow their name or precede their name, and by others who are also equally qualified but in another way. And Joe mentioned that the philosophy of set of practices don't appear to have equal effect on all soils and in all situations. And Steve just summarized very quickly that essentially the research bears that out or supports that idea. Bob, if you're with us, Bob Jones Jr., if you're with us, I know we had some connection difficulties earlier. Joe gave us a great summation of his operation and his experience, including with soil balancing. Are you in a position to give us an overview as well?
I think so. Good afternoon, everyone.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
hear you perfectly, and it's a great thing.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Technical difficulties. I think it was operator error. We have the Chef's Garden is a family vegetable operation. We have about 400 acres in total. About 125 acres each year is in vegetables, and the balance is probably most correctly named as forage crops. They are cover crops, but they're cover crops specifically grown to forage harvest and then apply back to the vegetable acreage. So we're doing a lot of work. We're on sandy loams, and we have struggled for as long as we have farmed on these sandy soils to get the organic matter up, the humus content up, and the CECs to go in the right direction. As Joe was mentioning, it's very difficult to do this on sand. We're making some headway. We'd like to have a little bit of that clay he has over there, but we don't want all of it. But we are making some headway. We look at soil quality as is probably a three-legged stool, as everybody is probably already aware, and that is basically physical structure, chemistry, and then biology. And we believe very strongly that all three are very well interconnected and have both positive and negative connections and influence on each other. The soil balancing, we're using the same numbers that most everyone else is. We want base saturation. Our target numbers are 70% calcium, 5 to 7% magnesium, or a 7-to-1 relationship on calcium potassium, magnesium calcium around 5, potassium around 5%, between 5 and 7. We've been able to, through using cover crops, and we're now using multi-species cover crops plantings, 4 to 8 different species on a cover crop, then forage chop that, and in essence sheet compost back onto vegetable acreage of sandy loam soils with aged straw and these forage chops, and then come in with some compost teas, as well as our mineral application based on the crop that will go on that land on the following year. And we've been able to make some real headway here on the farm in moving both the base saturation numbers, but as well the CEC numbers. And we think that that's really the key for us. The higher we get that CEC number, the less mineral application it takes to grow the crop. We're really trying to learn how to manage the energy that's in the soil. We've been working with soil balancing and trying to increase our understanding of soil balancing for 15 years. And we studied Reams and Kerry Reams. A lot of his work was taught by Dan Scow at International Ag Labs, and that's been our exposure to it. Early on in the process, I became very confused because I was studying Reams' work, Neil Kenzie's work, in later years John Kemp's work, and have tried to take a little bit. They're all basically working off the same premises, but each one has just a little bit different attack to how best to accomplish that. Best advice that I can give anyone is pick a horse in the race and stay with that horse so that you don't confuse yourself. But it's working. We're raising the CECs. We're raising the organic matter levels. We're getting the calciums up in that 70 to 75% ratio with magnesium in line with that of 7-to-1. And that we seem to be seeing a very marked improvement in the quality and the shelf life of the product that we're growing.
Excellent. I'm going to hit the temporary pause button and just mention that we're getting some excellent comments by the portal that I mentioned earlier, go.osu.edu/SBNow. And one of the questions has been, what are these target percentages again? keeping in mind that many of the listeners may have very little experience with soil balancing, but obviously they're curious. You've heard Bob mention some ideal ratios or percentages. You've heard Joe also mention some. There is a soil balancing use guide available from the OSU team as based on input from Joe and Bob and others. That's online, and of course this call is being recorded, so you're welcome to go back, and cherry pick the specific information that you might need. Bob, you used the word taught, and just as it happens, a person who registered for the call and while doing so submitted another question also used the word taught. And their question is reads like this: I was always taught that soil balancing is pseudoscience, and encourage farmers to look at other components of soil tests. I never worried about soil balancing when I was an organic farmer, and experienced well above average yields. I'll be curious to learn if there is a scientific truth to soil balancing. Now, folks, I'm not in a position, and I don't know if anyone truly is in a position to say what is truth, okay, with regard to soil balancing, but I know that members of this team have been learning a lot about it thanks to the input that's been shared with them, and I hope that others are learning a similar amount. I think I'll turn to Doug Jackson-Smith next to address this truth question, but also I'm going to frame it this way, as I have framed it with other people on the team. Are there any scientific principles that make soil balancing valid? That's different than truth, that it works. So maybe Steve first. Are there principles that we look at in basic soil, quote-unquote, fundamental soil science that say, you know what, this is entirely consistent with the idea that soil balancing could work?
Sure. We talked a little bit about this on last call, but we understand the role that cations play in soil quite well, and we know that calcium amendments, particularly gypsum, can be used to manage soil structure, and it happens all the time in salt-affected soils, say in western parts of the United States, when there's improper irrigation management and things like that. One of the kind of more contentious issues when we're talking about this deals with the fact of calcium versus magnesium, both as divalent cations, as cations with two pluses, as opposed to sodium and potassium, which have just one plus, one charge. And so they play a disproportionate role in terms of bridging organic matter and formation of organic matter with clay particles. And so that's really, we know that that's an important mechanism, but really some of the science, the jury's still out in terms of the role of calcium versus magnesium, in terms of the role that each one of those play with structure. Yeah.
Certainly. So just paraphrasing, there appear to be components of soil science that would support the notion that soil balancing could be useful, right? It's not completely fabricated. As one of our previous callers and registrants said, why would thousands of farmers practice it if it was complete bunk? Right? They wouldn't. So, Doug J. asked maybe to recast the same question that this person had. Is there scientific truth? What have you been hearing from people that you speak with about soil balancing in terms of their truth? How do they look at soil balancing and its applicability to them and its utility to them?
Well, as those who listened into the call last time may know, and I'll just say now, my role on this project as a university scientist working on this project has been to focus on documenting and trying to get numbers around what the usage of soil balancing under a variety of definitions might be, and what the kinds of experiences people who are consultants or farmers that have reported the use of soil balancing. So in a nutshell, there's a conundrum or an interesting puzzle behind the whole project, which, as Steve said, is the case that the scientific literature has very little support for the idea that adjusting through calcium amendments or calcium-magnesium balance alone, getting consistent results in terms of crop yield and to some extent other outcome indicators. But the reported use and recommendations and satisfaction with practices that follow the guidelines of soil balancing out there in the field is quite widespread. And if we think about that, it's either that everyone has got the wrong idea and the science is completely right, or that the science has yet to kind of address maybe some of the things that might be going on that people's experiences document in a way that replicates their practice in an accurate way, or is measuring things in a way that's trying to capture that in a way that scientists would understand. So this project's been trying to bridge that gap, and we've been trying to both do our own experimental work, and Steve can talk quite a bit about the extensive trials we've had where we've done experiments trying to add magnesium or take magnesium away or boost calcium or not, and what we can see under those conditions over many years. But we've also been working on-farm to see what we observe and what we can document occurring on real production circumstances. And I don't know if this is the right time to talk about it, Matt, but one of the things we did on the project is go out and interview a lot of people who are soil balancing practitioners and then use that input to design a survey. And we sent the survey out to, almost 1,600 organically certified corn growers from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and heard back from almost 60% of them, almost 860 people. And what we asked, as among other things in that survey, we provided a definition of soil balancing that has these ratios. We said if you assume soil balancing is 65 to 75% calcium, 10 to 15% magnesium, and roughly 5% potassium, and you use calcium amendments or gypsum and other kinds of things as a way of manipulating soil cations, do you follow that practice, or do you consider yourself a soil balancer? And what we found was almost over half of the respondents said, yes, we follow those guidelines and so forth. We then asked them to describe what they did, and they wrote a lot, but interestingly enough, only about 20% of those wrote about base cation exchange capacity in a way that was really clearly a hardcore, what we call base cation saturation ratio, or BCSR approach. And they also included a whole bunch of other practices, and in many cases we would say there was no evidence that they were really using kind of a traditional approach. So that 50% number gives us a high end of the range. That's probably the outer limits among the organic corn growers in this region who are following soil balancing. But the low end is probably 20%, and that's probably an undercount. What that tells us is that there's a sizable fraction of organic producers who find this to be one of the major philosophies or approaches that they use to manage soil and soil nutrients, but as well as that soil quality. The other questions we asked then among those who said they soil balance is, what outcomes have you observed? And universally they report quite high numbers, impacts on crop quality, crop yield, changes in soil texture like water infiltration, drought tolerance, overall soil quality, and to a lesser degree advantages in terms of plant health, insect and weed pressure. Now that's by no means a physical measurement of what's actually occurring on their soil, and it's by no means a certainty that what they were doing when they report those outcomes was simply a traditional balance or chemistry balance approach. But it underscores the fact that there's a lot of people out there doing things that are loosely organized around soil balancing and having enough positive experience that they continue to do so. So Joe's experience with the farmers he works with is a good, I think, testament to the fact that they probably wouldn't go back to Joe as a consultant if things were catastrophically failing. The challenge for us is to figure out how to do additional scientific work that can kind of unpack what might be going on in those fields, in those farms, where these consultants and farmers report outcomes that the scientific community has been unable to reproduce to this point.
Perfect. Josh, are you with us still? Might need to *6 your handset if you're on one of those, or I was hoping, Josh, I was hoping to.
Can you hear? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
You lost me for a while. The connection dropped, so I missed a large chunk of what people were saying there.
Did you hear what Doug Jackson-Smith just had to say?
Just the very end of it, yes.
Okay. Well, I won't put you on the spot too much, but I would like to pick up where he left off. There are quite a few threads that could go from what Doug just offered us. Let's turn to numbers that you might be most familiar with. But for the benefit of the group, Could you just explain quickly what your role and responsibility is at the University of Kentucky?
Sure. I'm the basically the soil fertility extension specialist here at Kentucky for about the last 4.5 years, and before that for a little over 8 years in Maryland as well. So I'm responsible for making fertilizer recommendations, and I guess I could be characterized as the naysayer in the group regarding managing calcium and magnesium ratios or using more traditional BCSR as a fertility philosophy.
Well, fair enough. So is it fair to say that you've seen a fair number of soil tests, data?
Yeah, I look at soil testing data, I guess, pretty frequently.
And have you detected in any way like a shift in some of the data that are coming in that are in those reports with regards to like a trend in pHs, a trend in calcium or magnesium levels or their ratios as you see soil test reports?
I can't say that I've seen that directly or, quite honestly, have been looking for it. What I can say is that I think when we look at big trends, which we've done some looking at bigger trends in soil testing, the big number here is that we see much more frequent soil testing due to precision ag, which happens to be one of my main focuses. And so I think looking at some of the metadata can be somewhat misleading because of how we sample for precision ag across those large numbers of soil samples that we look at. Sure enough.
So, again, owing to what you said that you didn't hear parts of the previous discussion, I was just wondering if, speculating, knowing the soils of Kentucky as you may, right, or at least the area that you're most active in, doesn't have to be bounded by the state line, but knowing the soils that you do as you do, and at least the basic precepts of soil balancing, and some of which we heard from Joe early on. Do you think 20% of the soils in Kentucky may qualify? I mean, putting aside for the moment is whether or not they should be managed that way. Let's just ask the question: how many acres may qualify for a balancing-based approach to a balancing proponent? Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, so if we're talking about qualifying, I assume we mean, CEC above 10, silt loam with a higher clay content, not a coarse textured low CEC soil. Is that what you're referring to as far as?
Fun with that, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the majority of Kentucky. So Kentucky is almost exclusively silt loams, and I would say, probably 3/4, maybe not that much, but over half are probably CECs at approaching 10 or above 10. A lot of clay soils and a lot of poorly drained soils. We have a large area in our largest grain-producing region in western Kentucky of fragipan soils, a chemical fragipan resulting from marine sediments historically, and we have a large segment of producers from central Kentucky going west that believe their drainage issues, and it's not just soil balancing, but within the popular ag press, people on the call are probably familiar with things like Ag PhD, the YouTube or the TV program with the Hefty brothers and things like that are proponents of these high clay soils to improve drainage. You've got to bring up your calcium because high mag soils have poor drainage. So we hear that quite frequently across Kentucky.
What about the Maryland experience? I mean, you may have also got a bit into the Delmarva Peninsula. I don't know, but certainly from your Maryland experience, what can you say about that area, or at least the soils that you knew there?
Yeah. So the Delmarva is mostly very low CEC, sandy soils. We see BCSR, people talking about cation saturation balancing, and sometimes people talk about it in a kind of very loose sense. They've heard about it. It sounds reasonable, and they talk about balancing cations, but I don't know that they're pursuing it as a management strategy other than, they've heard about it and they kind of repeat it. But we have very low CEC sandy soils on the Delmarva. You go west of the Chesapeake Bay, and you're going to get into those silt loams or even heavy clay soils going west. Again, it's something that we see dominates sort of alternative agricultural markets, if I may, like organic producers. And I think it's because they're looking for something different. They're managing different, so they believe that they need a different approach to soil fertility, perhaps. But there was never conversation as much about drainage, only in very limited acres.
Interesting. So I guess as a quick follow-up before we move on, with a large percentage of Kentucky's acreage possibly qualifying according to the BCSR soil balancing, I'll call them precepts or guidelines, academically, do you have an interest in exploring what soil balancing like tactics may bring to the stakeholder group there, or are you more settled on certain aspects of the science already?
I think that most of the interest in Kentucky is involved around drainage, and I think there is room, being an extension specialist. Extension specialists, I would say, a large part of our job or calling, as it might be, is looking at what we consider settled science. In other words, demonstrating that the advice we give is valid, but also not going in with a predisposition and having the experiment designed so that alternative outcomes are possible. I would be shocked. I think certainly we see poor drainage associated with higher magnesium contents. It doesn't have to do necessarily with the calcium to magnesium ratios within the wide ranges that are prescribed by these balancing approaches I've seen, but rather it has to do where correlation is not always caused, and we have perhaps high smectite clays that are limiting drainage but are also happen to be high in magnesium. And there's not much you can do in some of those situations. And so, I think we do have a calling. If you're asking, should we be doing more research and generating more numbers? I think so in this regard, because it is a question that at almost every soils talk I get. Can I improve my drainage by increasing the calcium to magnesium ratio?
Right on. So our third call on December 12th is going to be about the next set of questions around soil balancing. So we don't necessarily want to start that call now. We have 40 minutes left in this one focused on the numbers that we have in hand, or would like to have. But if you were to look for a set of numbers and put a set as a highest priority for you in terms of kind of unraveling this role that you just mentioned, between soil management and drainage and then crop and farm success, what numbers would you look for first? Offhand, do you have a sense for what those numbers would be in terms of if I only had this data set, I could do blank.
So in listening to this call and listening to the last call, we kind of talk, I think, qualitatively and somewhat subjectively about these benefits over time once we switch to these different management approaches. And what's missing from that conversation is that large field, which is working in precision ag. That's my wheelhouse. That's all we kind of work around. Kind of large plots that encompass the field variability, but with that control. So not that I switched the whole field over to a balancing approach, but within it there were control large exclusion areas where I use a sufficiency only approach and just look at fertility. Everything else being managed the same. And so that comparative relative data set of a balanced approach versus a more traditional, sufficiency-based fertility approach, and that comparison. I think that's really, where we need to start. Well said.
Doug Doohan, before I turn to you next, I'd like to turn back to Doug J.S. real briefly on a question that, again, picks up on what you summarized before, and I think something that Josh just referenced. The people that you interviewed, and maybe you also heard from through the survey, they reported what they did, and they shared with you what they did. And in part of the message that I believe I'm gathering from all of that interaction is that they may ascribe to use balancing-like practices, but not only those.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the gap between the reported experiences and the things that we've been able to reproduce using controlled experimental trials is that farmers, while they do a lot of experimentation and informal trials, are often adapting and managing differently to every year, and they're also utilizing practices that go well beyond, certainly organic farmers, that go well beyond just managing their calcium-magnesium ratio. So many of them are also using essentially what I'd call a slant approach to manage traditional crop nutrients and reed and soil tests. And it isn't an either or, but it's both. And then the use, given that this was a sample of organic farmers, of compost amendments, manure amendments, and a laundry list of additional kinds of amendments, are the stock and trade of how they manage their soils on cornfields. And that makes it very difficult in practice to isolate what the effect of just that BCSR component practice might be, because it's rarely the only thing that they've done.
Right on. So, Doug Doohan, there was a question submitted very recently along with the registration that we can begin this section of the conversation with you if you don't mind, and then come back to others who have also had their hands in some of the research. And the question was this: how did the soil balancing trials this past season, but let's extend that to our farther back, and Steve already gave a bit of a summary for some of his research, but this registrant asked, how did the soil balancing trials this past season on the university and off-site trials perform? Which trials did the best? Did more inputs produce better results, etc.? In the first call, you helped establish that one of the reasons for your interest as a weed scientist in soil balancing is in the connection between drainage and perhaps weed populations. Feel free to comment on those as it applies to the weeds data from the project, or something else. But overall, what are the results showing from the weed side with regard to the so-called soil balancing effect?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. First of all, can you affirm that you're hearing me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, still coming through? Okay.
Yep.
So just kind of picking up on the thread that I think I've identified going back to research that started about 2007, what we've noticed is that farmers tend to associate weeds with moisture, with flooding events, which I have come to see. Now, this is an impression, not something that I have absolute proof of, but my impression is that this flooding really refers to in-field ponding. And that weed problems tend to be more severe there, and that those areas are areas that are sources of weeds that then spread to other parts of the field as well. And we've seen that thread continue through with the notion that weeds reflect imbalances in a very general sense, mineral imbalances in the field. So in some places, we've actually had farmers who've talked about too much calcium. In other places, it's been farmers talking about not enough calcium, which, again, I think reflects perhaps easiest just to say confusion about plant mineral nutrition available to the plant from the soil. So when we first undertook to get involved in this particular project, weeds were actually, and the role that soil balancing might have on weeds, was really one of the primary variables that we were interested in. And so we've been watching it very closely, both by taking measures of weeds in the field in our experimental plots, some ones that Steve referred to earlier, as well as looking at the return of weed seeds to the soil and the quantification of weed seeds that are in the soil each year. So to do that, we do what we call exhaustive germination. We take soil samples really early in the spring, late in the winter, before any germination has taken place, and we capture, by doing that, we capture weeds that were shed by plants the previous fall, as well as some weed seeds that had been deposited perhaps years before. And we go through a cycle of what we call exhaustive germination in the greenhouse, which basically exhausts that reservoir of weed seeds so that everything has germinated. And in that process, we count, we identify, and we count by species. Now, in our most mature trial, in our longest running trial, which we call the West Badger experiment, basically comparing dolomitic lime, calcitic lime, gypsum, and then a fourth or fifth treatment that is actually kind of a biostimulant type of treatment as well as calcium. That trial was started in 2014, I believe, and so now we have got 4 or 5 complete summers in on that, and we've been doing this exhaustive weed seed germination every year. Up until this year, we were not able to measure any statistically significant differences in weeds based on the treatments that were used. But in 2018, and the data is not, we haven't completely exhausted these weed seed bank samples that were taken this past spring, but we are in the process of. And what we are seeing now is that we have less giant foxtail, less yellow foxtail, and less total weeds when we add everything together in the plots that were heavy calcium amended. In particular, those plots that had gypsum and limestone added. And those are statistically significant data points. Now, we are not seeing an effect on any other species. Like we can pick out the 2 foxtails. There's definitely something going on there. There are many other weeds, such as giant ragweed, for instance. Any of you who have been to those plots will know that they're full of ragweed. We're not seeing any effect on ragweed. And we're not seeing on, like if we took all the annual broadleaf weeds together or all of the annual grasses combined, so yellow and giant foxtail, green foxtail, barnyard grass, we're not seeing an effect there. But we clearly are seeing what seems to be an effect on those 2 species. And so this actually matches up fairly well with what we are hearing from farmers at least what I've heard from farmers that I've talked to over the years. Annual grasses almost always seem to be kind of a category of weeds that farmers will say soil balancing seems to help with. We have seen some indications on some of our on-field trials as well, but we really need to get some more years in. Now, the final thing I want to say, Matt, is that in addition to this West Badger site, we have experiments at another farm in Worcester. It happens to be the East Badger farm, and we also have an experiment at Herzl, at what we call the Herzl farm, which is at the bio incubator in near Bowling Green. And we have not seen effects at those 2 sites, only at West Badger. And I realize now that I made a mistake. I'm saying that West Badger is our oldest site. It actually was East Badger that is the oldest one. We have not seen any effect there. West Badger, I think this is probably our 4th season of data collection. That's a good place to stop, I think.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I would like to invite, anyone on the call to unmute themselves and speak up with a question or a comment if they have one. Sometimes in these conversations, people get very comfortable and they sit back and listen, which is great. But if you have a question or comment that you've been wanting to share, but the conversation's been kind of flying by you, now would be a good time to bring it up before I put Steve on the spot again, because I know he's itching to be put on the spot again. Just can't wait for that opportunity. Any questions, comments? Okay, hearing none, well, we'll turn to Steve again before I turn back to Joe and Bob, because I know that they're very, very anxious to be to contribute as well. I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, and it's been a phenomenal conversation, very much appreciated. And we're doing our best to focus on the numbers, focus on the objective, as Josh, I think, very succinctly and correctly pointed out that some of the assessments are more qualitative, which those have their place. Today is a day for numbers. Now, folks, I have a bit of an advantage. For those of you who are kind of new to the conversation, I've had the privilege of observing the team's work through these past 4 or 5 years and have a working sense for what has been discovered. but not a complete sense for sure. I am aware that Steve earlier on gave a very high-level overview of the data and the results. What he did not say, for example, is that he's looked at physical parameters of soil, chemical parameters of soil, and is opening the door to biological parameters of soils. And what Doug Doohan just shared with us earlier, and what Joe shared with us, and what Bob has shared with us, very much overlaps with what I think Steve might say, in that there's a timeline to the effects of any approach. Bob alluded to this when he said, pick a horse and run with it. Bob, I don't want to overreach, but that was my connection between the two. Steve, if you could take just a minute and provide another example or two of the individual components of soil status, physical, chemical, maybe biological, that you have measured, and are you seeing stronger effects of a soil balancing like treatment in one or more of those than other ones, and on a different timeline, or is it all kind of one way? Is there a different timeline of effects to different parameters?
Sure. Well, I'll address the timeline question first. And we understand, of course, that soils often do take time to change in terms of responding to different management, physical properties being probably the slowest of those things to change. So it's not, as scientists, we recognize some of the limitations in our approaches. We understand that maybe a 3 or 4 or 5 year study might not truly be sufficient to see all of the changes that can take place if we are, say, practicing implementing a BCSR approach, for example. I think that that's an important thing. If you look at the literature that has been published on this, and we've even looked, we've tried to contact people through surveys, fertility specialists, folks that are analogous in my position and Josh's position, for example, asking if they've done work on this but didn't find anything, so therefore didn't publish, right? So there's lots of, we've been as exhaustive as we can in terms of seeing the work that has been done. I would characterize the work that has been published as not particularly incredibly robust in terms of it being, particularly long or very encompassing. I think that the project that we have here is probably going to document the most exhaustive look at it in terms of a number of different angles that we're taking. Moving to the second part of your question and thinking about, yes, we have been looking at some of the biological parameters, organic matter characterization. We've been looking at soil physical structure. This summer, we went out and we measured infiltration rates systematically at both our Herzl site and our West Badger site here, and also using a penetrometer for measuring penetration resistance as an indicator of soil compaction. And interestingly, at the Herzl site, which is that heavy Hoytville clay, we found in the treatment where we're adding magnesium, so we're purposefully unbalancing that treatment, right, and we're adding magnesium sulfate, we found about a 3-time lower level of infiltration in that site, and we saw increased penetration resistance. So it's interesting to point out that our gypsum, that site actually was, that soil profile was not particularly unbalanced to start with, and so the treatments where we were adding calcium and driving the ratio even farther, more calcium to mag, we did not see any differences relative to our control site. But for those magnesium applied, we are seeing in this 4th year decreased infiltration of water and increased resistance, increased compaction, essentially a compaction layer. So that's encouraging, right, for us. I mean, it's no fun to go out and do experiments and find absolutely nothing, no effect with anything that you're doing. So I think that we're, cautiously optimistic that these results can be replicated, and that We've done them again this fall after harvest. We have not had a chance to analyze those data yet. We'll probably do them again next year and just see how repeatable this phenomenon is, and if we can maybe repeat it at other sites, other locations. Yeah, I don't know if I said this, but our West Badger site, we saw no differences in infiltration or penetration. So the lower textured soils have not yet been responsive to calcium or magnesium input.
Fair enough. Good time to check in with anybody on the call if they have questions about what has just been said or shared recently. Questions or comments for any of the contributors so far. I think one of the take-home messages is that this is that we're setting ourselves up well for call number 3. What questions remain? It would seem in my mind that there are a number still, and as Bob mentioned, I think, Bob, I don't want to steal your thunder, and we'll come back to you pretty soon, but working on those soils of yours, we're looking to improve the organic matter for, over the 12-year period I think that you mentioned, that choosing that horse and running with it, choose wisely, and then how to determine when you've bet on the right horse, or maybe need to change horses. Joe, if I could turn to you next. You heard Josh mention the rough percentage of soils that may qualify for a balancing-like approach, in the sense of this is when it's supposed to work. What's your estimate of the same with regard to the acres that you're familiar with in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana? Do we have a large number of acres out there that may qualify for balancing that are not yet using the approach?
Yeah, can you hear me, Matt?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Forget if I'm muted or not muted from time to time, but I think there's a lot of acres already under this type of management, but there's also others that could move to this type of management. And one of the things that I look at where we're located, anybody familiar with Ohio knows that we're in an environmental hot spot right here as far as agriculture. And if we can improve, first off, this isn't a more expensive system to use than a traditional system that ignores soil balance. So if you can improve water infiltration, there's so many aspects of crop growth involved. If you can improve that, as we can talk planting date, stand, compaction, disease, nutrient efficiency and loss. We see cover crop performance. Since 2008, we've run 300 plus full field nitrogen studies with our customers, and we had 4 rates, 3 reps, and we took optimum N rate by calcium-mag relationship. And we know when we go to the field with nitrogen, if we've got a 3-to-1 calcium-mag relationship, we have got to add nitrogen, because bad things happen to nitrogen in that soil situation. Also, if we have a good relationship on those clay soils, I'm talking 5 or 6 to 1, we can reduce nitrogen. We've got several fields came in this year at 0.7 pounds of N per bushel, well over 200 bushel yields. And we work for bottom line on these farmers, but what about the environmental impact? We need to do something out here, and if infiltration and filtering, as opposed to runoff, and also building water-stable aggregates, we've got another tool out here that can help agriculture as well as the environment. And we did a study with Dr. Warren Dick where we did the field work. It was a gypsum study. The paperwork's out there. And by applying gypsum to these heavy clay soils, we reduced phosphorus export out the tile by 50% in 10 different fields over a 3-year period. And, we also measured magnesium. While we were measuring that phosphorus in the water, we measured mag. And for a 2.5-year period after that application, we had increased magnesium out the tiles under the gypsum application. And so it can be manipulated. It's not real expensive. There's cost-saving components of it. I just say, every day we go to ag now, you better have an open mind because it's going to change on you. That's a long-winded answer, Matt.
No, not long-winded at all, Joe. I appreciate that very much, and appreciate the inclusion of numbers and the treatments and reference to the percent gains and losses. I very much appreciate that, and a reference to the economics. That these are numbers I would argue that Sabu Kumarapan and others are working to try to obtain, but you and others in your network also have a sense of, or have hard numbers for as well. That the bottom line, the farm success bottom line is first and foremost the priority. And Bob, if I could turn to you next about that bottom line, do you feel like you've chosen the horse and gone with it in terms of and it's balancing, this calcium? You said you're shooting for the proper ratios. Again, I want you to speak for you. Have you basically chosen a balancing like horse and seen the benefits to you? Seen benefits?
A couple of statements before I answer that question.
Sure.
Awful hard to get a farmer who is making money to change anything that they're doing. So most of the time, folks who are willing to look at something different or a different management philosophy are willing to look at a different philosophy because the philosophy they're using is not working. And that's how we kind of came to this. We were seeing it was taking us more and more inputs to create the same or less output. As well, at the same time, we had customers continually telling us how important quality was. And for us as vegetable growers, quality is flavor and shelf life. And so how do we improve the health of the soil, consequently improving the health of the plant or the produce that's coming off of that soil? The soil balancing from our perspective, and one of the things that you will never hear me say is to tell another farmer how they should do it. I can only say what works on our farm. Going back to the question of the truth. What's the truth on your farm? And then go with that. And you can only do that by experience. My father told me a long time ago that the best fertilizer you can put on a field comes from the soles of your feet. And that means walking through the field and seeing what's going on and listening to the plant. The plant's the best test mechanism we have. Does the plant look healthy? We also think that the soil balancing is one piece of the puzzle for us in our farm. Getting the chemistry right and in balance is one part of the program for us. The biology and then the physical structure. Tiling, well-drained soils to start with. Obviously, we're on sand, so that helps us, but you can still have compacted sand. And that's very problematic because the organic matters are very low. And then your CECs are very low. I have soil tests here. When we started this process 15 years ago, I had some organic matter numbers that were 0.5. High organic matter sand for us at that time was 1.5. We're now getting numbers up into the 3s and 4s that we never thought we would get. We've got CEC numbers up above 13. We started with 3. But it's a combination of in our belief in our farm, on our farm, it's getting the soil and the appropriate balances or the ratios to each other, and then getting the organic matter in there. And really, organic matter is a precursor because what we're really looking for is humus. When the previous speakers are talking about, I never understood when I was reading about water infiltration and water holding capacity, and yet they're the same thing. I was confused by that early on. It's the same mechanism, having humus and structure and globulin content in the soils to flocculate the soil or aerate the soil. when Joe talks about the water infiltrating into the soil and pulling air into it. That also positively affects the microbiology because, not unlike humans, the soil biology needs food, air, and water to survive. Comfort makes it thrive. So if we don't put a stressor on that microbiology, it will do even better. And having the soil balanced in the right ratios, getting the biological life up. The greatest addition of humus comes from plant roots, whether it's crop or cover crop. You get a lot of humus benefit from having, and which is why we're doing multi-species cover crops, because the more roots, the more species, the more diversity that you get in microbiology. And, Reams said years ago that we're really managing energy. You're talking about the relationship of the sun to the plant and the plant to the microorganism. The plant in root exudate is feeding the microorganism. The microorganism is converting the soil minerals into a plant uptake form so that they can go back to the plant, so you have that symbiotic relationship. But Reams said that we live off of the energy of the nutrient, not the nutrient themselves. So you're really converting sunlight energy and photons through photosynthesis into energy for the organism, which in turn feeds the plant. And there's just this whole microbiome you're hearing a lot about now. And the physical structure improves when you get more humus. And so I guess my answer to your question is that the soil balancing portion of this is one part of the overall puzzle as we have seen it and experienced it here on our farm.
Thank you. Very well said. All of which, towards the end there, the particular factors or variables, I should say, that you mentioned, beginning with photons and ending with nutrients in the plant. Most all of those can be quantified in one way or another. Most all of those can be represented in charts and tables and graphs at one point, and some of them are already in that form already. But of course, we do need more, and that'll be the subject of the third call. Bob, one last, if you could indulge us, like maybe just one more minute before we wrap up. There are a couple of questions that people submitted, again, along with their registrations, that we haven't touched on here. We might have to come back to them at some point. But real fast, just a quick response is: do you pay more attention to pH or the calcium-magnesium ratio? Or are they equally important to you?
More attention to calcium-magnesium. Back in the dark ages, when I was at Ohio State, we were taught a lot about pH management and organic matter management. Those were two really important measurements that we looked at in crop health. And the treatment to change pH was to add lime, which was adding calcium. So you got a positive plant response by altering the pH. Was that because the pH went up or because the calcium went up?
That's quite possibly. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't really know, but my feeling at this point, some 30 years later, is that it may have more to do that the pH is an indicator, not a cause. And same way with organic matter. We looked very heavily at organic matter, but you can have organic matter content in your soils. If you don't have biology, the organic matter content isn't going to have the effect, the desired effect in soil health, as it would when you have carbon and organic matter into the soil that has a good numeration and diversity of biology to consume that organic matter and turn it into humus. Humus is what changes CEC, not organic matter.
Okay. So, Bob, one last thing before we move on. The benefit from your experience here. As you have invested heavily, clearly, in understanding this and other approaches more fruitfully, and also spoken with many other growers far and wide. What is your sense? Are more and more farmers coming to this way of thinking and this set of approaches? Is it steadily increasing? Is it or not? Are you alone, or are more and more people kind of joining in this discussion?
I have been told many times that the saying that a farmer is truly outstanding in his field has multiple meanings.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a very lonely feeling. I will answer the question this way. I have attended the Acres Conference probably 10 times over the last 20 years. I don't go every year. And that I've picked up a lot of information from that particular conference because they've been looking at eco-agriculture for a very long time. One of the things that I can tell you, and I believe that it is, that more and more people are paying attention to this. Also, the bionutrient conference that you turned me on to a few years ago. One of the things that struck me as I attended those meetings last year was the increasing attendance from the medical community. Easily, a third of the attendees at both of those meetings in 2017 were from the medical community. They are searching out healthy food options and are looking more and more all the time at how food is being grown. I think that's an indication in and of itself that there's something to this, that the way we have been growing food in this country for the last 50 years, if you talk to the health experts, we may not have it completely and totally figured out yet. I know we're learning all the time, and I think it's about leveraging the natural processes that occur and trying to accentuate those natural processes and not necessarily fight them. The weed conversation that Doug had. There are schools of thought that indicate that weeds are nothing more than an indicator of a nutrient imbalance in your soils. And I have seen enough positive results over the last 15 years that I tend to believe that.
I'm just the moderator. Thank you very much, Bob. I'm just the moderator of this particular conversation. I'll step aside from that role real fast as we close and say I agree with you. In my 22 years of doing what I do, I've never seen a particular cohort of people as I saw at the Bionutrient Food Association conference. I told Dan that. I told others how amazing it is to have the agricultural and medical communities talking at the same time in one place. So that was just me stepping aside for a moment. So I share that observation. Folks, I recognize that we're approaching 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and want to acknowledge the very, very important contributions that the resource people made today, all 6 of them, patiently and very thoughtfully contributed to the conversations. I'd like to just end with 1 minute of wrap-up for what comes next. What comes next is you'll have an opportunity to listen to this call again because it is being recorded and will be placed at the website. And if you have any trouble with accessing it, please do let me know. The third call and the third and final call in this particular set is on December 12th. It's at the same time, 1:30 p.m. to 3 o'clock Eastern, same as today. The confirmed resource people for that call currently include, again, Doug Jackson-Smith of Ohio State University, Matthew Krause of BioWorks, and James Schultz of Midwestern BioAg. You'll want to pay attention to whoever else may join their ranks. That call will focus on the remaining questions about soil balancing. I say only kind of half jokingly. I mean, there will be more questions than there are more questions, likely be more questions than we will come up with, but we will focus on the ones important to the group assembled for that particular conversation. We're going to ask, what do we need to know? We hope that you will join us for that call. We also hope that you will share the invitation to join the conversation with other people that you think might be interested or be able to contribute to that. And, of course, if the web is useful to you, you can find out additional details about the conversations at the particular URL. So unless there are comments or questions that people would like to offer at this point, and I'll pause to let somebody do that if they would like to share or ask a question. Hearing none, I'll ask that we wrap up today's conversation and wish you a good rest of the day. Take care.